start the recording. Thank you, Linda. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Oregon. My name is Tuong Vu, and I'm the professor at the University of Oregon. And today I'm very honored to be the discussant and chair of this great panel. The colleagues that I have met with and worked with for many years. And the title of our panel is Translocative Vietnamese American Historiographies, Anti-Communist Republican Nationalisms. And we have 4 distinguished presenters in this panel. The order of the program, the order in the program, we're gonna have to change a bit, and we will start with Yi Thiên Nguyen, who's was just kicked out from Northwestern University to work for us because he graduated. So congratulations again. So he's now a research fellow at the University of Oregon U.S. Center, U.S. Vietnam Research Center. And his paper is titled When State Propaganda Becomes Social Knowledge. Our second presenter is Professor Tuấn Hoàng, who's associate professor at Pepperdine University. And his paper is titled From Re-Education Camps to Little Saigons, Historicizing Vietnamese Diasporic Anti-Communisms. And my third presenter is Dr. Trinh Lu, who's also a research fellow at the U.S. Vietnam Research Center, University of Oregon. And her paper is titled Vietism, Human Rights, Carte and the New Vietnamese. And our last presenter is Vinh Pham. I hope he has graduated, but no, right? Still a graduate PhD candidate at Cornell University. And his paper's title is Rhizomatic Transnationalism, Nhạc Vàng and the Legacy of Republicanism in Overseas Vietnamese Communities. So please join me in welcoming our presenters. Let's start with Yi, please.
All right, let me share screen. All right. So hello, my name is Yi Thiên Nguyen, and I will be presenting my talk entitled When State Propaganda Becomes Social Knowledge. So I would like to begin by playing this short montage of a recent Vietnamese American film. At the same time, I will read an excerpt from a propaganda document drafted in 1956.
Vào lúc đen tối nhất của vua Lê Lai, một vị tướng trung thành đã liều mình cứu Chúa. Ông ta lấy áo bào và bộ áo giáp của vua Lê cùng 12 chiến sĩ giỏi nhất. Đêm khuya, Lê Lai dẫn quân xông ra chiến đấu với quân Tàu. Kế của ông ta là phá vỡ vòng vây để Lê Lợi có thể trốn.
Ở dưới đó nghe em, đợi từng nào mình ra tới hải phận đã.
Chuyện gì vậy?
Tụi tuần tra đường biển, nó đang rượt tàu dược biên khác.
Tụi tôi phải làm cái gì đây?
Không làm gì hết. Tất cả mọi người, thiệt là yên lặng nha. Công an thấy mình xác lắm đó.
And on this last attempt, which was their sixth, they were finally fortunate enough to escape the chains of the Vietnam, to ride at the shores of freedom. Drawing from the experiences and previous failed attempts, this time to prepare fishing nets, take a fishing expedition, but had to proceed in the dead of night. A communist police stations along the way had to keep women and children underneath the deck of the boat and had to cover the mouths of children to prevent them from coughing or crying as to avoid the suspecting eyes of the communist police. For some 7 to 8 days, although they had to paddle against the waves and the winds of the vast ocean, the adults endured starvation and thirst to save rice and water for the children, because in fear of the communist police, they dare not to bring with them much provisions. Floating on the vast ocean, placing their fates upon the winds and the waves of the endless ocean, all they had was the belief, a firm belief in protection of the omnipotent, and a hope of yearning for a life of freedom and warmth under the safeguard of the Republican government led by President Ngô. And it was because of this belief that their love for freedom that they, the 17 freedom warriors, reached the land of freedom. So this excerpt, which is shown on the screen of Vietnamese, that I just read, was developed during the Communist Denunciation Campaign to describe the political significance of the mass migration of Northern refugees following the signing of the 1954 Geneva Accords. Although written in 1956, the passage demonstrates stark commonalities to the 2000 film displayed on the screen. Directed by Ham Jung, the film depicts experiences of Vietnamese refugees following the fall of Saigon, from hiding below deck to fleeing the dead of night. The broader themes of fear and desperation, the passage appears to articulate almost a scene-by-scene narration of the passengers' experiences on the rickety fishing boat of Dai Nghĩa. These themes of freedom, flight, communist repression, and noble sacrifice are evident in both production, although they are temporally removed by more than half a century. The core driving question I am addressing in this talk is precisely this similarity. Although the migration following the Geneva Accords and that following the fall of Saigon share certain historical commonalities, the analogous ways in how these two events are depicted cannot be reduced to something innate to these events themselves. Indeed, 2007 Vietnamese America and 1956 South Vietnam were worlds apart. As I argue, the similarities between these two temporal markers is less an obvious consequence of being refugees in flight of communism than it is the survival and perpetuation of a political narrative that dates back to the formation of the First Republic and continues to influence Vietnamese America today. This perpetuation is political achievement of nation-building efforts on the part of the South Vietnamese state. This perpetuation makes Vietnamese America a political legacy of the ideological work designed to form not only an anti-communist Vietnamese nation, but anti-communist citizenry whose political loyalty will remain to that of the Republic, its flag, and its ideals. Centering on this question of historical continuity, my project intervenes in contemporary scholarship in two major ways. First, it addresses the scholarship on Vietnamese Americans, which has largely emphasized memories of war and trauma of the refugee journey to think about the origins of Vietnamese American anti-communism, rather than looking into the anti-communist politics that existed during the Republic of Vietnam. Second, my paper provides a grounded political history of the Vietnamese Republic within a Vietnam War scholarship that primarily focuses on American intervention or Vietnamese communists. This approach has largely ignored the agency and voices of non-communist Vietnamese actors. By laying out the history of ideological work under the Republican period, I hope to demonstrate the historical tissues that connects Vietnamese America and Republican Vietnam. I also hope to counteract a definition of anti-communism that is solely premised on notions of experienced trauma, communist atrocities, or memories of war. I argue that it's important to view present Vietnamese American anti-communism as historical construction, a result of processes that date back, that predates the 1975 migration. Doing so, I hope to sketch out and encourage new directions in Vietnamese and Vietnamese American studies. I hope to initiate a conversation about contemporary legacies and relevance of a political entity that has ceased to formally exist some 4 decades ago. With such a conversation, I believe the scholarship can begin to shed light on the ways in which elements that belong to a lost era can somehow survive, and provide insights and context into the issues, politics, and norms that exist in a present-day community. To empirically map out the ideological work of the Republican era, I rely on an unstudied, now I studied it, but it's a political education initiative called the Political Study Program, or PSP, deriving from the activities of the person and the person's philosophy of the Kung Lao Party. Political study was designed to cultivate loyalty for the regime in power while ensuring that those attending study sessions would absorb the ideas propagated by the Republican state. For the designers of the program, it was not enough for students to simply know the materials presented. Participants were to integrate the lessons taught into the everyday conduct, how they view the world, and their role in the development of a Vietnamese nation. Developed during the Republican era, the PSP standardized both engagement and content of ideological discourse. Structurally, political study activities were directed from the top down and was led by a central body that assigned study materials and monitors study activities. As a key program of ideological dissemination, the PSP provides a valuable avenue to explore the ideological work under the Republican state. First, the PSP was one of the few state projects that was enacted at the start of the First Republic and actually survived into the end of the Second. Apart from a 20-month hiatus following the collapse of the First Republic, the PSP was a regular and continuous state effort, and thus provides a documented chronology of the Republican era. This allows me to empirically trace the actual activities of states' ideological work. Second, the practice of political study was routinized aspect of administrative life. Each organizational unit of study was expected to devote approximately 2 hours weekly to this task. Third, because the PSP activities were also enacted outside the state, particularly as an essential component of broader mobilizing projects, the content of these sessions can serve as a proxy to examine the broader ideological discourse. And last, because the PSP was most effectively implemented within the South Vietnamese administration and military, the study of the PSP provides a lens into the internal and quotidian activity of the Republican state. Moreover, because these former administrative and military personnel would eventually become community leaders of the Vietnamese diaspora, the program's emphasis on state agents provides empirical linkage that connects the ideological work of the Republic to the political dynamics within Vietnamese American communities today. Historically, although major administrative changes often brought with them different ideological emphases, values of nationalism and anti-communism were readily apparent in the study materials, regardless of whatever administration was in power. On the slide is a graphical summary of the major structural and ideological transformations that occurred throughout the duration of the PSP. Given time constraints, I cannot extensively detail the institutional history of the PSP. Summarily, however, there are many iterations of the program. Despite these changes, the fundamentals of political education remains core to the program. Key study materials were disseminated to support major state projects during moments of political change and turmoil and for important national holidays. Transcript of speeches of presidents or high-ranking officials were also regularly utilized. Due to the state demands for consistent and regular study sessions, political study was deeply embedded into the administrative life of the Republic. This was an achievement of continuous effort by various regimes to ensure that sessions were well attended and enthusiastic. Different mechanisms were implemented, including professional training of cadres for presentations, standardization of study materials, a system of reward and punishment to ensure active commitment, and attendance keeping. These efforts by the state allow political study to become routinized as a practice and allow the PSP to survive as long as it did. This durability of practice allows ideas taught through the program to endure as well. What this means is that the narratives, examples, frameworks, and terminologies taught during the First Republic were redeployed by later regimes. To demonstrate this discursive continuity, I used the example of the South Vietnamese narrative on the Geneva Accords. Themes, rationales, and lessons related to the 1954 Geneva Accord developed during the First Republic would make their way into the study documents of the Second. This realization allowed the lessons taught in one period to reapply to developments temporally removed from the events that originally inspired them. because of the routinization of political study, state narratives that were once novel were transformed into taken for granted truths that were habitually reutilized to frame new events and historical developments. The narrative in Geneva, of course, can be seen as the origin story of the Vietnamese Republic. For one, it established the beginning point of communist atrocities against the people of the South. For another, it lays out the justification for why the Republic of Vietnam should be supported and why adamant anti-communism was necessary and obvious. Among the original topics studied with the inauguration of the PSP, the Geneva narrative lays the groundwork of South Vietnamese condemnation of communist atrocities. First, as a narrative that legitimized Ngo Dinh Diem in his contest against Bao Dai, it regurgitated Diem's position that because South Vietnam did not sign the Geneva Accords, they cannot be bound in any ways by these agreements. Second, it rejected the proposal for reunification laid out in the Accords because, according to Diem, the independence and reunification of the country must be in freedom rather than slavery. Third, the narrative paints the communists as traitors who doled out North Vietnam to international communism and who manipulated the national aspiration of the Vietnamese people. Fourth, it blames the division of the country and the horrors of war on the communists and depicts the communists as collaborators to French colonialism. And last, it criticizes communist-supported measures to establish peace or neutrality in the Cold War. And on this last point, the critique of the concept of normal relations stand as an illustrative example. Presented as a communist scheme, study materials argue that although communist efforts to establish normal relations sounded very gentle and humanistic, the communists, in fact, were beating the drums while stealing, meaning that the communists called for peace while preparing for war. While much of the study materials developed during the communist denunciation campaign revolved around articulating and providing evidence of communist atrocities, following the reorganization of the PSP in 1958, study materials increasingly became tailored to diplomatic concerns and South Vietnam's standing in the free world. These new focuses emphasize Vietnamese underdevelopment, democratic progress, and personalism as a solution to Vietnam's post-colonial economic and political woes. These developments affected the articulation of the Geneva narrative, which began to incorporate a contrast between the free South and the repressive North, and was expanded to depict communists as not only deceivers and traitors, but also those who were military aggressors and violators of the 1954 treaty. The common refrain was that while the communist North signed the treaty and ended up violating it, the South, on the other hand, did not sign the treaty, but desired peace and thus worked to enact its provisions. These revised themes on the Geneva Accords will continue until the final days of the First Republic. However, despite the death of Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963, the narratives established under his rule did not die with him. Rather, they were repurposed by subsequent regimes. This was evident with the Day of National Resentment, an annual public commemoration on the 20th of July, formally inaugurated under the administration of Nguyen Thanh. In 1964, South Vietnam commemorated 10 years of communist atrocities. The week leading up to this commemorative holiday involved state-funded public events, stoking the resentment of the Geneva Accords. One of the few instances in which political study sessions were utilized during the PSP's 20-month hiatus. Study documents painted the South as a peace-loving people and the North as military aggressors. More novel to the time, study documents also deploy the concept of Dak Diem, or Northward March, to rile up anti-communist sentiments and support for the new military regime. Under the Second Republic, the Geneva Accords took on novel dimensions as the narrative was reapplied to frame the negotiations that were underway in Paris. This was a process of wrought controversy. And so the Thieu administration sought to carefully toe the line between its war mobilization efforts while also justifying the regime's participation in ongoing peace talks. Faced with these contradictions, the Republican state regurgitated the insistence that South Vietnam was a peace-loving country, but was disastrously wrecked by war, a war caused by the Vietnamese communists in collaboration with the French colonialists. Through study materials, the Thieu administration laid out its fundamental demands that communists retreat all their troops for peace to be actualized. However, peace, although desired, was slim because firstly, the countless atrocities that were committed by the communists, and secondly, the deceptive nature of Vietnamese communists evidenced in the violation of the Geneva Accords. As Washington and Hanoi neared a deal towards the end of 1972, political study materials began emphasizing communist duplicity and the inevitability of communist violation of any signed treaty. Indeed, even prior to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, the treaty was already being framed in accordance to the dominant Geneva narrative that had informed Republican policies for almost two decades. After the Paris Agreement was signed in January of 1973, study documents sought to depict the Republic as the winner in this peace deal, but quickly returned to themes of communist duplicity and aggression in violating the ceasefire. Now, to say that the Geneva narrative somehow ended with the fall of Saigon is to ignore how contemporary Vietnamese refugee communities talk about their journey after 1975 and how the Geneva Accords and the Paris Agreement haunt Vietnamese American political conversations today. While an extended historical exploration of anti-communism as exists in America goes beyond the confines of this talk, we can point to instances in which Republican narrative on the Geneva Accords influenced Vietnamese American political discourse after 1975. The key example is this 1982 publication by the National United Front for the Liberation of Vietnam, or colloquially MACTRUN, or the Front. This organization dominated Vietnamese American politics during the 1980s. The pamphlet that is displayed on the screen, entitled Chúng tôi muốn sống, utilizes photographs of death and destruction caused during the war and after to conjure an image of perpetual communist brutality. Themes of communist atrocities and suffering following the Geneva Accords are evident throughout its pages. And the document connects the migration following the Geneva signings to the refugee flight following 1975. More recent examples are displayed on the screen. In contemporary Vietnamese American politics, communist atrocities, both personal and national, are regularly mobilized to provide moral and ideological justification for anti-communist activism and protest. The key message that I want to leave with you today is this discursive and political connectivity between the Republic of Vietnam and Vietnamese America. The anti-communist politics that is currently prominent in Vietnamese American communities is rooted in the anti-communist politics of the Republic of Vietnam. However, this prominence is neither given nor automatic. Instead, as my exploration of the PSP demonstrates, specific narratives were systematically and carefully disseminated by the Republican state. These narratives were realized under different historical contexts and by different regimes. These narratives and this realization continued after the fall of Saigon. The anti-communism we see in Vietnamese America today is no accident of history. It was the product of purposeful and meaningful activities like that that was practiced through the PSP, allowing certain ideas originating in the state to become ingrained hegemonic. While I do not go into empirical depth about the reconstitution of anti-communism in Vietnamese America, I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. The discursive and political continuities discussed in this talk provides a new way of thinking about the Vietnam War and Vietnamese America. The scholarship on the war can begin to talk about the contemporary legacies and relevance of a political entity that ceased to formally exist some 4 decades ago and was spatially removed half a world away. Vice versa, scholarship on Vietnamese America can begin discussion on the ways in which elements belonging to a lost era were somehow reconstituted and remade overseas. The scholarship can provide avenues to explore the historical legacies of the Republic in the Vietnamese diaspora, be they musical, ideological, social, or political. Those legacies are yet to be explored. Perhaps it is time that we do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Yi. That was a great presentation. Let's turn to Professor Tuấn Hoàng.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let's see. It's 5:28. I'm trying to keep track with time here, and actually, I hope to, bring it all in 15 minutes. So wish me luck. I have 3 things. First of all, the article that was published in the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. It's fairly long. It's actually my longest article I've ever published, and I'm very proud of it. And at the same time, ashamed of it that I couldn't make it shorter, more concise. But I do think that there is a great deal about the subject of diasporic anti-communism, some of which already came through, the presentation of Ethan Nguyen just now. So let me. I do have a few slides to show, but I think I will, present my things, on three basic points, right? The necessity of historicization and periodization, and then I will move into, for maybe 5 minutes on anti-communism in the diaspora, and then, given recent events, I thought of spending maybe the last 5 minutes on the South Vietnamese flag, and the kind of things that I'm kind of like begin to work on. So let me share screen here, and okay, here we go. All right, so I Google periodization, and these things pop up like like on Google Images. It's all about like bodybuilding. What is I have no idea. So I just thought it's pretty amusing, but I do want to stress that by periodization I mean it in a historical sense. When we look at an event, right? Let's say anti-communism or the South Vietnamese flag. In my opinion, as trained historians, I think that it is very significant to look at whatever topic is in terms of how it shifts in history. Sometimes it doesn't shift that much, but sometimes it does. And it is obviously up to the task of the scholar, of the historians and others to determine, right, how much it shifted and so on. So for the sake of simplicity, I would, I would invite us to conceptualize a diasporic anti-communism, in approximately two periods, maybe the 15 years, after the fall of Saigon, and then, from the approximately the early 1990s, maybe the late 80s, to approximately the present. And I would imagine that social scientists may want to even distinguish the latter period even further. But that is something else. Okay, so this is very crucial, I think, to my analysis of in this case diasporic anti-communism. Just more photos to those that E already showed us, right? Diasporic anti-communism often frequently accompanied by the South Vietnamese flag, right? It can take all kinds of forms. It could be about human rights. It could be about anti-Chinese. It could even be about the top right photo shows, right? It was a protest against a very popular Vietnamese singer, Đàm Vĩnh Hưng, when he came to the U.S. So it could take many forms, and it can also, be, gender and geography, plays these roles as well. One of the photos show a community, a diaspora community in France. So we see, their banners showing Vietnamese and French. And English as well. Another one, right, shows New England, right? So, definitely a very noticeable phenomenon. And I would invite, scholars and others to begin conceptualizing, anti-communism, diasporic anti-communism, or diasporic usage of the South Vietnamese flag, by thinking about the psychological impact of the fall of Saigon. We all are familiar, right, with the photo of the helicopter on top of the U.S. Embassy, with lines of Vietnamese lining up to, and I have to tell you, I dislike that photo a lot because it shows so much order. I like this photo because I think this photo conveys much better the chaos, the shock that South Vietnamese and even North Vietnamese too, experience, in late April, right? I mean, North Vietnam had planned for a 2-year campaign, and basically it won, a total victory within a matter of 4 months. So even they were delighted, obviously, right? But it was shocking. Okay, so I think that impact is very crucial for us to consider, in terms of conceptualizing, what happens afterward and so on. So anyway, that is one part of the article that I published in the JBS. And also, I specifically want to call attention to, post-war phenomenon. There were a number of them, right? The boat people crisis, for example. There was a great deal of there was anti-bourgeois campaigns. Economic restrictions and nationalization and all those things, right? And also especially calling attention to post-war incarceration, in the form of re-education camps. And I think it is very significant because, in my opinion, a great deal, not all, but a great deal of diasporic anti-communism sort of came from there. We had heard from E just a few minutes ago, right, about how some of it was developing in South Vietnam. So we need to acknowledge, we need to actually look even further into it, as E has shown us. But it also developed after the war as well, and that is my focus right now, right? And so by studying memoirs and so on, I argue, essentially that that post-war diasporic anti-communism, right? A great deal of it came from that experience of incarceration, partially because many of the men and women, there were some women who were incarcerated too, mostly men, right? When they came to the US in the late 1980s or during the 1990s, right? Many of them, not all, but many of them became very active participants in diasporic anti-communist activities. And that's just a photo that I found on the archives at UC Irvine, the Southeast Asian wonderful archives there. A photo of a protest in, I believe that was, I didn't find the exact date, but I believe it was in the 1990s, right? And we see in many ways a representation, right, of incarceration here, and I believe that was from Orange County in California. I argue that basically there was a different form of anti-communism before 1990, and I will come to that, right? But because there was a critical mass of immigrants, Vietnamese immigrants, right, who came, through the HO programs, right, some through family reunions, so on and so forth, right? They, I believe, really provided the kind of human resources and critical mass, that led to the association, when we think of Vietnamese anti-communism, with the flag. That's what we think, And even though there was some activity in the 1970s and 1980s, it was really, I believe, the 1990s when it opened up, and we need to trace it to the origin, back to the experience in Vietnam. So that is kind of my, the gist of it. But let me shift gear a little bit here, right, to the South Vietnamese flag, right? Because after all, right, I mean, January 6th is now, I imagine that when, a lot of people in ordinary Americans or ordinary Vietnamese Americans, when they think of the South Vietnamese flag, that's probably the first thing that they think now, right? So I also, I would invite you to conceptualize, and I'm still working this out. I hope to be able to figure out enough to make it into a publishable journal article or something like that. But in my opinion, right now, from what I've seen so far, right, we also need to conceptualize the South Vietnamese flag in terms of periods, in terms of historization as well. It is tempting to think of the symbolism of the flag to be unitary, right? To be stand still. Yes, it's true that there is always that association of the flag to the Republic of Vietnam. No question about that. But I think we also need to be careful, because in my opinion, the 70s and the 80s, the South Vietnamese flag was was seen to represent lost South Vietnam, the lost republic. But also, I think, it was also a source of identity for people who consider themselves to be Vietnamese. We need to remember that Vietnamese refugees, after 1975, when they came to the US, they were actually in the 70s at least, if not also in the early 80s, they were actually pretty skeptical against, towards the US, right? Because they view the US to have abandoned Vietnam, abandoned South Vietnam, so they were not at all positive about American government per se. And it wasn't until, like maybe the middle of the early Reagan administration, right, with the strong anti-communist rhetoric that, they began to view, right, America with, with some, with more positive, eyes and so on. But furthermore, I think the South Vietnamese flag during before 1990 was tied, to the desire of many Vietnamese to return to Vietnam, through force, right, to liberate Vietnam from the communists and to return to it. Okay, and these are some photos of the Kháng Chiến movement, the struggle movement, the one that Thien was talking about near the end of his presentation there. Also two popular singers. Anti-communist, very popular singers, right? With An and Việt Dung, the late Việt Dung, right there, they were like brother and sister. I mean, they call them, one another brother and sister, so to speak, right? And I have seen with An a couple of times in my, when I was younger, and she often has a scarf, with her just like this, right? And not infrequently she'll be wearing the South Vietnamese flag is a scarf, right? And so I think that this association is very important, right? Especially during the 1980s, right? The association of like desire to go back to Vietnam and liberate and fight the communists and so on. Well, that changes, okay? Because I think we need to think of shifting representation now, because I think that, with more Vietnamese coming to the US and other parts of the diaspora, we see a shift that, yes, it means the lost Republic of Vietnam, but I think the South Vietnamese flag begins to represent the post-war experience of Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese, elsewhere in the diaspora, at least, those who had identified themselves to the Republic of Vietnam, right? But I do think that, and this is something I need to look further into, and I invite your pushback, your encouragement, what have you. But I think it's worth looking into because to give one example, right? I think I saw Quan John in the audience there, right? Quan has written about this, has published about memorialization of the boat people, right? And and this is the 1990s began to see more attention from the diaspora, the first generation, right, about the post-war experience. In a way, oddly enough, they were kind of like done with the war in their mind, precisely because the post-war experience was so profound and so hard, so difficult, so challenging, right? And this is just only one example. I mean, there was also incarceration. There was also, right, the economic experience of poverty after the war. The experience of political discrimination, right? Of all these things. So I do think that I mean, I still don't know quite yet, how to think about the January 6th appearance of the flag. I have some ideas, but I do think that, though, at this point at least, we need to think carefully about shifting meaning of anti-communism, shifting meaning, of the South Vietnamese flag, among other things. So I'll stop it. Thank you.
Me unmute myself. Thank you, Tuấn, for keeping us on time. That was a great presentation. And, there's more recent stuff, which is also exciting. Let's turn to Trinh, right? Trinh is our third presenter. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Tuấn. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this panel. Please let me know when you can see my screen. Ready to go? Okay, great. Vietism is really nothing less than a vision of future man, of a splendid human race modeled after the earliest Vietnamese. It proffers the belief that you and I and everyone around us can evolve to still higher selves were we to tap into the collective unconscious that our ancestors have left for us. And we have only to look at Vietnamese antiquity for some guidance. But what exactly is Vietism, and how did it come about, and what tradition does it stand on? Who shapes it, and how has it recast Vietnamese ethno-nationalism? So my presentation today will try to answer some of these questions by examining just one strand of this novel but complex philosophy, and it's the use of a branch of psychology that Carl Jung pioneered to imagine a higher man, a yet-to-arrive ideal Vietnamese. Vietism's core ideas are drawn from the philosophical thinking of this preeminent scholar, Lương Kim Dinh. In South Vietnam before 1975, Kim Dinh had a towering reputation as a philosopher and teacher. In the more than 40 monographs that he would go on to write, Kim Dinh envisioned a new Vietnamese, an image for what the Vietnamese would act like, think like, be like, once they rediscovered the ways their ancient ancestors lived. This new Vietnamese, Kim Dinh thought, would arrive to one day overthrow communism in his homeland. But more than that, Kim Dinh believed that the new Vietnamese, above men of any other race, would be the ones to bring about peace and happiness to everyone the world over. In 1975, when North Vietnam took over the South, Kim Dinh was spirited off to the United States, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, more and more Vietnamese were rounded up for re-education and millions glided out to sea. Those who found their way out of the country regrouped. They took to the streets in Paris, Berlin, Washington, and Melbourne to call the communist government to account. They fundraised to help refugees. Many turned to the UN and its satellite agencies for help. Others, vowing to restore South Vietnam in the short run, staked their fortunes on the search for strongmen. And as their efforts crested, a number of intellectuals, among them Kim Dinh, looked at Vietnam and seeing how men were hunted down or hounded out of society, they feared that there would be no end to the bloodshed. Turning their gaze back to the Vietnamese abroad, then settling in different corners of the world, they saw trouble still. The militant groups that sprang up around this time had trained their weapons on one another, suspecting that fellow refugees are working for the enemy. So whether in Vietnam or outside it, the Vietnamese appear to have lost their way. To Kim Dinh, some psychological disorder had afflicted his people, causing them to act like men without souls. And if this were allowed to go on, Kim Dinh feared that the Vietnamese would be doomed to disappear. He thus set about finding a national soul, which he hoped could restore the Vietnamese back to health, training each to forsake his small vanity for the greater good. It may never have occurred to anyone else but Kim Dinh to find some guidance from Carl Jung. In his freestanding volume, National Soul and Ancestral Ceremony, published in 1979, this lifelong Catholic priest outlines a program for finding that soul. One way, he thought, was for the Vietnamese to break free from the mass. Kim Dinh saw the mass in the Jungian sense as a force that keeps man from looking into himself, possessing him, depriving him of the decision as how he should live his life, such that he becomes part of an unconscious herd, ruled, clothed, fed, and educated as a social unit. Taken on Carl Jung's view of man, Kim Dinh cast the contemporary Vietnamese as the product of a psychic infection, a dissociation between consciousness and the unconscious, an unnatural and even pathological condition, a loss of soul. This can be seen most clearly in the great socio-political movements such as socialism and communism. Kim Dinh suggests that the herd mentality first took shape in Vietnam in the 19th century with French rule and evolved into its vilest forms under socialism. By the 20th century, the Vietnamese had effectively become a parable for the modern man, plagued so deeply by a psychic epidemic that he stood defenseless against the mass. Western psychoanalysis had opened to Kim Din a view of Vietnamese history and the violence that it wrought as the consequence of either overlooking the human psyche or negating it, as did the socialist state, which drew its powers from the greatest gathering of the masses. Jung casted a long shadow over Kim Din as he reflected on how to turn the Vietnamese into a whole being. Firmly holding on to that vision, he tried to tap into the collective unconscious, which, according to Jung, comprises the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings. Archetypes are the building blocks of the collective unconscious. They are symbols which are older than historic man, which are inborn in him from the earliest times, and eternally living, outlasting all generations. This storehouse of symbols existing in the dark hinterland of the psyche lies ready for use in the unconscious of every man. Kim Din likened this notion of the collective unconscious to the soul of rivers and mountains, that is, the national soul. Inspired still more by Jung, Kim Din thought that rituals could bring the Vietnamese closer to his inner being, cutting loose the state's hold on him. He believed that rites could reactivate the powers slumbering in the psyche. So when Kim Din claims that the highest purpose of rituals is to bring one closer to the primordial man, he is drawn on Jung's belief that religious experience allows the conscious mind to preserve its link with the unconscious. And when Kim Din further claims that contact with the primordial man would restore unity to the psyche, he seems to accept Jung's premise that self-realization, self-actualization, is possible when symbols projected by the unconscious are folded into consciousness. Convinced as he was, Kim Din announced in 1984 that now as ever, activities aiming at perfecting man, like poetry, rites, dance, game, and above all music, are essential to unlocking the Vietnamese soul. Vietnamese letters and the arts were to become the medium tying consciousness to the unconscious, man here and now to the primordial man, the earliest Vietnamese who represent an original way of life ruled by the mother. To Kim Din, Vietnamese civilization was once matriarchal, peaceful, benevolent, when life had not yet broken away from the harmony of nature. 1982 saw him lay out two cultural stages that he thought defined Vietnamese history, one presided over by women, the other dominated by statesmen and hence motherless. He describes an early Vietnamese society based on the religious and civic role of the mother. The Vietnamese in this matriarchal state is said to have achieved a noble life, held together by a love for the soil. Kim Din suggested that as a general course of evolution, this society at last yielded to paternal rule in order to protect itself from foreigners. But over time, the shift to father rule displaced the original mode of life, such that by the 20th century, descendants of the Vietnamese could no longer remember the divinity of the mother. They usher in a Western culture full of masculine drive, which quickly took hold and gave rise to an imperium governed through law and reason. This view of Vietnamese history defines a communist state not as the logical end, as is often claimed, but the consequence of a certain decline in the psychological health of its people. Kim Din goes on to suggest that communism is a sign that a civilizational schizophrenia had seized his people long ago. Hardly his own, Kim Din's concept of a mother-centric order was taken from Johann Bachhofen's pioneering theory of mother right. In 1861, this Swiss anthropologist drew on myth, literature, and material artifacts to argue that a primitive state of matriarchy had flourished long before Greek polities came about. Back then, when farming allowed nomads to settle down, descent was traced through women. Before the shift to a paternal system, the relationship which stands at the origin of all culture, of every nobler aspect, of every virtue, of every nobler aspect of existence, is that between mother and child. Kim Din glossed this notion of mother right as the mother principle, and sometimes as matriarchy. Echoing Bachhofen, Kim Din claimed that traces of this primordial world are still present in myth. But unlike Bachhofen, who examined myth in order to come a little closer to the eternal meaning of things, Kim Din wanted to redeem the mother principle to one day recover this lost culture. In his view, the ancient world was something of a utopia where man and nature, consciousness and the unconscious, spirituality and sensuality had not yet separated. And this represented to Kim Din a supreme harmony in which the early Vietnamese had lived. Though he freely borrowed passages from Mother Right, Kim Din revised the Swiss scholars' theory along the way. Where Bachofen evoked the age of the mothers as a cultural stage that has passed, Kim Din saw Vietnamese antiquity as both historical and eternal. A world that is forever out of reach to Bachofen is to Kim Din a part of the collective unconscious, which is always present as a resource to transform man. Merging Bachofen with Jung, Kim Din saw the Vietnamese primordial mother as an image laid down in the collective unconscious of every man, and as a force for self-development and redemption. If through Jung, Kim Din had detected a psychological disorder in the modern Vietnamese, it was then in Bachofen that he found a cure, and that is the only way forward for the Vietnamese is to find the archetypal mother. To Kim Din and others like him, the mother is the collective unconscious, the mythopoetic source of consciousness, the Vietnamese inner character. They believe that if he dug deep enough, every Vietnamese would recover a link to the primordial mother he once shunned. She would guide him in his development so that he could move closer to the sacred goal of self-rule to one day, when brought together with those like him, overthrow communism in his homeland. In due time, they presented this lofty ideal, Vietism, as a model not only for their kin, but also for people of the third world to establish peace on which all races could flourish. The Vietnamese believed they were poised to lead this universal crusade for freedom, and in that belief, they opened the way for something messianic. Thank you.
You're muted too. You're muted.
Happen again to me. Thank you, Trin. Our next speaker is Vin.
Hi, let me just share my screen with everyone. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I previously gave this talk in Oregon with some of you, and since then I've been trying to think about the piece in a different context, because undoubtedly much has happened between the fall of 2019 and today. Since then, we have witnessed some major political events, such as the 2020 election, where unsurprisingly, a sizable number of Vietnamese community voted for the GOP, the storming of the US Capitol by rioters and agitators, where the South Vietnamese flag can be seen waving. Didn't you have the same one? And, you know, also there was this.
Hãy nhớ tháng 11 cùng nhau bầu cho tổng thống Trump. Người xứng đáng cho chúng ta cho lá phiếu bầu. USA, USA, make America great, great again. Donald Trump, Donald Trump cho nhiệm kỳ này. Donald Trump.
So, I see you put your hand on your face. What are we supposed to think of this? Notable Vietnamese scholars working on the diaspora, such as Viet Thanh Nguyen, were quick to comment on these Vietnamese Americans, though it was in a way that I personally found rather dismissive. To be clear, I do not think in the same way as these Vietnamese voters, and I also don't think like Viet Thanh Nguyen. But that last video of the people singing in unison on a stage, lit as though it were another iteration of a Paris by Night video, really made me think about what this type of music, or at least the form it takes and the aesthetic it echoes, really says about the kind of political power diasporic music really has. I don't have a complete answer to this question, but I hope that my piece can shed some light on some of these issues. Okay. While it's undeniable that the genre of nhạc vang and the wartime music as a whole was crucially important in the production of the nationalist sentiments in the RVN, I still think there's far too little critical attention paid to how its production and propagation abroad has affected the Vietnamese overseas communities. Aside from Adelea Rage's, Lynn Caroline Valverde, or Deborah Wong's work, most other critiques of these forms of music production tend to rely on the figures of nostalgia and melancholy as their main point of departure. Though these commentaries are certainly valid and necessary, I find that they can also come out as passive and politically ineffective, rather than active cultural agents that continue to fuel nationalist sentiments, which we can just see from that previous video. So here I will focus specifically on Lam Phung's Kieu Tay Do as a primary example of a cultural agent that fuels nationalist sentiments for the RVN from abroad. Because of this, I posit that qualitative terms like melancholic and nostalgic are incomplete descriptors of nhạc vang. I mean, it's certainly there. I think that is an aspect of it. I wouldn't deny that. And their continued usage in a way to brush over the sentiments of loss from those who maintain a nationalist identity with the RVN. However, rather than looking at this nationalism as a concrete monolithic ideology attached to singularly to the physical homeland, here I take it as a performance that locates the space of the nation within the diasporic imaginary of the impossible return, or a form of rhizomatic nationalism linked together by differentiated networks of belonging, which has no real center. Similar to Alexander M. Cannon, I do not think that Vietnamese music production nor its criticisms ought to be centered on any one of the diasporic capitals like Orange County, San Jose, Paris, etc. Rather, I think it is indeed a performance which seeks to build a transnational space instead of recovering a lost territory, though there might be elements of that, I think, in the earlier renditions. As with the examples of the karaoke sets and the copies of Paris by Night that Vietnamese families often have, what makes the cohesion of this transnationalism possible is the wide distribution and repetition of songs with the common ideals like Kieu Tay Do, which from my perspective, despite its name, refers to more than a shared identity based on departure and return rather than to an actual territory or locality. Oh, I'm sorry, let me go back. Okay. In Asia's rendition of Kieu Tay Do with Hoàng Anh, the video starts off with a wide shot of the stage made to look like it could be any milieu in the Mekong Delta, dressed in the traditional áo dài, though I would say this could also be somewhere in the central parts of Vietnam. Hoàng Anh's silhouette stands on a dock against the sunset backdrop where she begins to sing a segment in Cải Lương. Around her are several small boats and palm fronds populating the screen. As the segment about returning to the homeland comes to a close, she then approaches the foreground and begins the main song. These shots, interspersed with scenes of rivers and women in small boats, do not only establish a sense of place, they also perpetuate an idyllic image of Vietnam as a rural agrarian society. At a first glance, the juxtaposition of the visuals with the lyrics that Hoàng Anh seems to merely provoke a sense of nostalgia and melancholy about a lost country. Yet a more critical gaze will reveal that such terms do not fully nor accurately capture the imagery that is at hand, nor do they account for the political stakes such imagery implies. As a singer who has been around for decades and who has built her fame and career during the height of the war, the decision to have Hoàng Anh perform a song about exile in the former republic should not go unnoticed. Indeed, for much of the listening public in and outside of Vietnam, songs like these are often seen as purely nostalgic for the pre-1975 era. But as political critique, their influence was strong enough to warrant them being banned in Vietnam, I think some of them up until today. As Philip Taylor has pointed out, if one were to go to most cafes or bars in southern Vietnam in the 1990s, the music heard would most likely have been pre-1975 music recorded after in Orange County and smuggled back into the country by Việt Kiều. Seen as a tool of neocolonialism, this music represented a huge risk for the Communist Party's tight grip on cultural and ideological hegemony. On the one hand, this music was living proof that the vestiges of the old republic, while on the other, the fact that it could still be smuggled in and maintained a listening public undermined the party's appearance of absolute control within the country, which I knew caused, and I think many scholars have commented, caused a lot of anxiety for the Communist Party. Yet, even when critics agree that such music had profound political implications, the language used to describe nhạc vang still relied on such terms as melancholy or nostalgia as primary descriptors, and mainly from the communist government. Certainly, this rhetoric did not come out of nowhere, since aside from the emotive imagery and the songs themselves elicit, it was also the main charge that the Communist Party used to criticize the consumerist and weak culture of the RVN during the war. The underlying dual implication then is that while the music is too romantic and weak, right, both in quotes, it was also for some poisonous and reactionary. For this reason, Nhạc Vang's strong potential for corroding the social cohesion and public morality cannot be ignored. As a result, the strange contradiction of a cultural object being both weak but also dangerous imbues terms like melancholia and nostalgia with symbolic dimensions that really must be explored further. So in his essay, Mourning and Melancholia, Sigmund Freud characterizes, characterizes both the states of mourning and melancholia as being related to the loss of the loved object. Yet what distinguishes the two is that with melancholia, one cannot clearly see what it is that has been lost, and therefore it is more reasonable to suppose that the patient cannot consciously perceive what he has lost either. This distinction is significant in the sense that if melancholia is a pathological form of reaction to a lost love object that is unconscious to the patient, then it would even be more difficult to pinpoint what it is that has been lost and consequently how to treat the symptoms. In the case of the RVN, well, one cannot doubt the immense psychological processes that accompany the idea of lost objects in all of its forms. I would argue that at least within the literary and musical representation, this loss has been cathected into the very real loss of the Southern Republic. Even in popular speech, those who identify with the RVN, I presume, such as the people singing in the video I showed you, will refer to April 30th, 1975 as Ngày Mất Nước rather than the communist commemoration of Ngày Giải phóng miền Nam. In other words, the loved object here is not one in the realm of the unconscious, but rather quite evidently encapsulated and explicitly named within the object of the country. Here we can take Viet Cang's Vietnam Tôi Đau or Lam Phung's Muk as two cultural objects that directly reference this loss as something real. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this song. I've heard it way too many times around family occasions. In the example of the song Muk, this loss is described in the second stanza with the lines. This first line, which is more of a question, serves as an inquiry into whether the lover who is exiled knows of the fact the Republic has been lost, with the following lines detailing the exile that ensues. In Chiều Tây Đâu, the sentiment is replicated, also replicated in this line. Where the lost country is once more immediately followed by exile. For our interest, it is in the singing voice conscious knowing about this loss in both examples, which makes mourning, at least in the Freudian perspective, a more suited term for describing the reactions and subsequent sentiments. Indeed, the sense of loss is so evident in Chiều Tây Đâu as a loss to the ego that the nature, as represented by the winds and the trees, are also implicated in this act of mourning to draw further attention to the differences between the two states. Later in his essay, in the same essay, Freud explains this, sorry. So in the same way, that the phrase bakong, everyone or folks, we can translate it that way, which gives the image of women and children to represent large groups of people. So too are the three images offered here as a heuristic for the entire Vietnamese society. Starting with the image of the Vietnamese mother waiting for her son who has gone into exile, followed by children roaming the streets and then their wives missing their husband. The main point of the stanza is the misery caused by the disassembly of the familial unit with the most vulnerable members left behind. Sorry. Show that again. Like, so you can see how it breaks it up into the mother, the kids, and then the wife. My conviction then is that The Communist Party's insistence on terms like melancholia to describe Nhạc Vàng, which is adopted by many critics, served to detach the idea of this loss to something concrete, which is to say a sort of denial of the Southern Republic as something that was real or at least worth it. In other words, to ensure or to in order to assure the cohesion of the party's narrative, it has to deny the lost object as a real object, and therefore to delegitimize it as a form of mourning. Basically to say, well, what are you guys really complaining about over there? Similarly, even with this seemingly descriptive term, nostalgic terms like nostalgic are not neutral in their deployment, since to be nostalgic implies a certain acceptance of a past as past, and in a certain way, an acceptance of the present. And our current present is one in which the lost object is actually lost or potentially does not exist according to whatever narrative you follow. However, given the examples above of the politically active overseas Vietnamese communities and the way Nhạc Vàng has been used to bolster their nationalism, it cannot be said that neither the people in these communities nor the rhetorical question in Kiều Tây Đô in any way a sign of acceptance of this past. They're obviously not happy about it, right? Instead, the line is an active contestation to the party's politics. In this way, the continued usage of the terms like nostalgia and melancholia as critical terms ignore the very purpose of what songs like these actually do, which is actively engage as a form of catharsis, as well as provide a space for dissent and mourning. So the second part seems a little bit desperate, but or disparate, since it was a much longer piece that I wrote. The part about the transnationalism is significant, so I'm going to talk about that. In Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, going against Noam Chomsky's linguistic model, they describe rhizomes not as something that can, not only as something that can assume diverse forms, but that they can also be linked to one another, like assemblages, without having any fixed points or hierarchy. Unlike trees, which have roots and thus have a sense of order to them, rhizomes instead might be better understood as freely associating themselves with the larger whole. In other words, they're less individual units in a sense than they are a form of multiplicities. I suggested that discourses on overseas Vietnamese music and cultural production, more broadly speaking, should not be focused on the diasporic capitals, such as the ones I've mentioned, Orange County, Paris, San Jose, etc., since their purpose were not to produce a transnational identity detached from centers. They were. This is because, like rhizomes, diasporic nationalism cannot be determined individually or quantifiably arranged and ordered in a particular hierarchy. Even though many diasporic capitals do exist as cultural capitals for the community, in my view, they function less as fixed points where nationalist thinking is concentrated than as a network whose vitality is dependent on a collective synergy. This is because centers like San Jose and Orange County do not only produce cultural objects, but they also themselves depend on the circulation of these products in order to envision themselves as part of a wider cosmology of the diasporic community. Indeed, it is this capacity to see themselves as part of a more global network and as less isolated enclaves, which sustains their political stance. For this reason, I find it useful to think of diasporic nationality in terms of rhizomes, that is, a form of collective transnational identification that has no direct center, since what holds their bond is the identification with the return and not the homeland itself. So in conclusion, my intervention is not just to say that we as scholars need to look at this music as cultural objects of a politicized population, but indeed a performance and a maintenance of the political itself. And I think what I'm trying to think of, or the direction I'm trying to think of, is if we just look at it as what it is, it can do us good in explaining some of the phenomena we see occurring in the Vietnamese community with its concerning its own politics. But if we map it onto the American political landscape, then it produces a much better picture of why we continue to see the South Vietnamese flag, which is like a concern that you've had, right? And why it continues to appear and to just sort of have this sort of bearing, and why there's constantly this type of music that accompany it as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vin. We do have 20 minutes for questions. Unless anyone has any questions right now, I can just, kind of say briefly about this panel. As a discussant, I have only, a few brief notes, and I can just start now. But in the meantime, please send your questions through the chat, and then, I stop, whenever I see a question, and then read your questions for the speakers. So basically, like I think I mentioned U.S. Vietnam Research Center before, and we have been promoting research on the study of the Republic of Vietnam, Vietnamese republicanism, and the history of the diaspora, Vietnamese American diaspora. And we've had a conference, where some of you presented, and we have 3 books in the pipeline. One is forthcoming, in which E's paper was included. The second one is co-edited by Trinh and myself, with papers by Vinh and Tuấn. And then the third volume, we hope to publish it soon. Also has paper by Linda, by Tuấn, and also by Ivan and Quân and others. So so we're really excited about this. And the presentations today raise a number of questions for scholars of Asian American studies. The first kind of question is about the history of our community. Do our community have a history? When they left Vietnam, before they left Vietnam, right? So like many studies of Vietnamese Americans just start at the time when they left Vietnam, but they're actually a long history before that. And that history actually mattered to them a lot today, and we need to understand it, that history, to understand the community. The second kind of set of questions is about the nature of their nationalism, right? So were they actually nationalists, at the time of the Vietnam War, while they were fighting the war? Even though they have been often seen as the puppets of the American, or lackeys of American, were they really nationalists? And what is the nature of the nationalists back then, and what is it today? And I think Vinh points out a very good kind of point about the rhizomatic kind of nature of the nationalism today, and it still matters today, right? And then another set of questions is about certainly Vietnamese American anti-communism. As you see from Trin's presentation, it does have a philosophical foundation. It does have a history, a long history, going back to the First Republic with E's paper, or going back to the re-education camp. It interacts with the communists, all throughout Vietnam's modern history. It wasn't a static thing. It wasn't just an emotion, a fleeting emotion. It wasn't something that they got from the Americans when the Americans came to South Vietnam. No, it originated long before that. And then it's also not a tool. When the Vietnamese refugees came here, as a recent scholar claimed, they tried to project it so that to legitimize their place in America. No, it's not. It has a long history going back to like decades before that. So the papers are very important to emphasize that point. And then it's also not a sign of backward looking mentality. It's not a symbol of Vietnamese American failure to assimilate and look to the future, as you see from the pro-Trump supporters. Even they really kind of take it to a new level, right? They take it to a new level with their support for Trump. So it's a dynamic thing. It's not static. It's important to the community, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, but the Vietnamese Americans have the ability to look forward and to grab the opportunity to promote their causes and so on. Okay, let's that's, I think I have more, but then let's stop because we have a question here from Duyên, right? The first question by Duyên. Duyên, do you want to ask that question?
Yeah, I can say something. So my question, just in general, as I was thinking about the framework of periodization, working in kind of a movement context, there's often a sense of understanding like protest cycles of aspects, but also the ways that anti-communism is part of a frame of a greater movement. And I think in Yi's dissertation, he actually has a really great graphic showing different movement aspects and themes, and human rights being one that transcends a longer period of time. So I was wondering, in the work that you're doing in your article, if you thought of putting it in kind of a movement framework as well as the flag. And one aspect that I note in terms of contemporary period, the flag is now sometimes used in Vietnam as a tool of resistance too. I think maybe about 2013, there were some youth, I think her name is Nguyễn Phương Uyên, and she was posting that flag around Vietnam, and also in the context of like anti-China sentiments, using that to show her nationalism, her patriotism. And so there's a transnational aspect I think we could discuss with the flag as well.
Let's take another question, and then the panelists can answer. Kwon, you have another question? You want to ask them?
Yes, so I have actually I had two questions I put in the chat. So I'll if it's okay. Do you want me to ask them both, or just okay? Okay, so the first question. Well, first of all, thank you for this incredible panel, and you know, I think the scholarship is presented here. It really does add a lot to the way that we are thinking about Vietnamese Americans' experiences in history, and help us reframing both temporally and geographically, but also in different forms of you know, formations that are happening. So the questions that I have first for Yi is that I was really struck by the appearance of the phrasing Ngày Quốc Hận quite early, right, the pre-1975 moment. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that Ngày Quốc Hận that you mentioned in relationship to the Ngày Quốc Hận after 1975. What might be some of the similarities and differences that you have observed? My other questions for Trinh, I was very interested in Kim Din's ideas, and I was just wondering on how well read his ideas were, and what might have been some of the responses to this notion of Vietism among the Vietnamese reading public. Thank you.
Okay, I'll begin. I'll be brief because I know that, you know, there are so many wonderful questions there. Good to see you, Kwon and Duyen as well. It's been a long time. I would say this. I'm still thinking about that, you know. And in terms of framing, yeah, definitely. I'm thinking of how limited, you know, in a way that Vietnamese refugees back then, right? How limited symbolism they had, you know. So in a way, the South Vietnamese flag and then the South Vietnamese anthem, you know, they just had a few things to work with in terms of, you know, right, a symbols of their identity. And so, you know, we need to be extremely careful, I think, to, you know, which is why I think I believe, you know, we may even have to look like, you know, every 5 year period, you know, to see like if there were symbolism, you know. I mean, like when I read Washington Post op-ed by Viet Thanh Nguyen, you know, and I have to tell you, I did not find it convincing because it presents a very static view, you know, of you know, nostalgia. Essentially, that was his argument, right? That you know, Vietnamese immigrants and refugees, they fly the flag out of nostalgia. I think it is much more complex than that. I think it has a lot to do with the post-war era more than with, you know, nostalgia for the Republic of Vietnam. But in terms of framing, I totally agree with you. You know, I do need to look further into, right? Because I do think that, you know, I think the Trump presidency, I think, represent a little something called break in terms of the symbolism of the flag itself. So, thank you.
Okay, who would like to take more questions from Kwon? Did you ask Trinh and Yi, right?
I can take the two questions directed to me. So then I think the first one was on the similarities and differences between the two Ngày Quốc Hận. So then the one that's pre-1975, it was originally directed at the Geneva Accords, and it was about how sort of like the war itself, basically all the suffering that the Vietnamese people had endured was the result of this division, and the blaming of that division was on this sort of scheme between the French colonialists and the Vietnamese communists. Now, the point I made in the presentation was that this can be seen as sort of like the origin story that gave rationale for the existence of the Republic of Vietnam, why there was an anti-communist republic to begin with. So then in the post-1975 era, I think it was a reutilization of this term to point to the origins of Vietnamese refugees, why Vietnamese refugees were abroad and why they were against communism. And so there's a similarity in terms of themes, but then the point of reference in itself is different. And obviously you can see the date in itself, April 30th versus July 20th, as being sort of like why there was this, why, the suffering happens and whatnot. And so the second aspect of it, the second question was sort of how much the Geneva narrative of communism reflected other countries' attitude towards communism. So then I don't necessarily see Republican anti-communism as sort of something that is exclusively unique, in the sense that it draws on various external sources. It draws on, sort of like conversation going on internationally, conversation going on in Europe, conversation going on in the United States, to build a sort of like a coherent explanation, rationale, narrative that explains the Vietnamese condition. So then in terms of the narrative itself, it uses the Vietnamese experience and sort of its history in order to articulate something that makes sense. And in itself, it blends with broader narratives. At one point, one of my former professors came up with this idea of world ideology, world narratives that were going on during that time. It was liberalism, socialism, and conservatism, and sort of like how there are sort of like these broader debates, broader conversations going on, and how Republican anti-communism was a parcel of that, but at the same time, it spoke to something unique in the terms that it spoke to a particular people's experience. And I just want to make a quick comment on sort of like Tuan's presentation, because I think it was absolutely fascinating. And it got me thinking about sort of like, I think firstly, we have to think about the relationship between the flag and anti-communism. And if something like that is divorceable, and thinking about, should we examine something like this as sort of something as co-evoluting together in terms of like the examination, or should we see it as something as something separate? So then thinking about the discourse that informs the sort of symbols and how the symbol itself is used. And I think that that might be able to help us think about the various ways in which anti-communism itself has been used, and the various ways in which the Republican flag has been used. And one of the most interesting things that came out of the recent election was not, to me, it wasn't the flag at the Capitol, it was the flag at Black Lives Matter movement, which was like sort of like the demonstration of the modularity of the symbols and the ways in which people have reappropriated it to be deployed in various sort of like political venues. And so thinking about the varieties of not only the discourse, the stories that we tell ourselves about where we come from and who we are, but also the type of symbols that we have within our repertoire and the ways that we can transform it. And so, yeah.
Great, thank you, Ý. Trinh?
Thank you, Juan, for such a provocative question. Perhaps I can try to answer that by looking at current relevance. The current relevance of Kim Din's works in contemporary Vietnam. So Liam Kelly recently documented the fascinating ways scholars in Vietnam are turning to Kim Din's works to shore up their version of Vietnamese ethno-nationalism. It's surprising and fascinating because for a long time, Kim Din's works were banned. It was not until 2012 when the Center for Enlightened Wisdom in Hanoi held a symposium to commemorate the 15th anniversary of Kim Din's passing. And among the invited guests were Communist Party dignitaries and members of the National Assembly. And Hanoi scholars credited Kim Dinh with helping the Vietnamese people rediscover their original selves so that they can so-called renew the nation. And of course, the anti-communist dimension of Kim Dinh's works are not dealt with at all, so that only selective elements are extracted for study. And one of which is Kim Dinh's claim that ancestors of the Vietnamese had occupied areas that is today known as China and have established the foundation of what we now call East Asian cultural tradition. So that it's really fascinating to see how this continues to develop and what areas of Kim Dinh's thinking becomes or are used to support an anti-Chinese nationalism. But going back in time, it's hard to say how popular Kim Dinh's writings are within the diaspora, partly because by all measures, Kim Dinh was an exceptional scholar who studied and critiqued Eastern and Western philosophical traditions. So his writing draws on Taoism, Confucianism, Kant, Nietzsche, Simone de Beauvoir, and so many other scholars, touching on psychoanalysis, sinology, archaeology, philology, ethnography, ethology, so many other disciplines. So you can imagine that it is not really the kind of writing that is easily accessible to the general reading public. But there is a small coterie of intellectuals who were with Kim Dinh from the very beginning. When he was in 1960s, teaching at Van Han University, Dalat University, Saigon University, for example, he already had a following, and he circulated among the most esteemed writers of South Vietnam, who also espoused his ideas. When he was spirited to the US in Missouri, he also was in touch with his students, and in a very quick time was able to establish a transnational network of scholars who then used his idea as a basis for thinking about what Buddhism could very be. So I have Deng Văn Ân, for example, in Paris, was trading letters with Kim Dinh, founding his own journals to publish his ideas, right? Scholars like Cung Đình Thanh in Australia did the same thing. And so Vietism continues to evolve to this day, and it's really fascinating on what else these Vietnamese scholars in the diaspora will pull in order to develop the philosophy. Thank you.
We are kind of out of time, but I hope they don't kick us out. Like we have, a few more minutes. So let's start. We can, maybe we can ask Nancy and then Vivian to ask your questions.
We can hear you, Nancy.
Please unmute yourself. Nancy, you know how to unmute yourself?
I can see it in the chat. I can read it out loud, Nancy.
Oh.
Yeah, so Nancy asked me, the yellow flag, many Vietnamese Americans consider to be an identity, especially today, with the community having a lot of international students from Vietnam who fly the red flag. I think the community will resent strongly. What is your proposal to the change? And then Vivian asked also me, is there a generational dynamic to pluralization and politics, such as the immigrant waves? Okay, very briefly, Vivian, I don't know. Mainly because I study second generation, Vietnamese American. But from what I have observed so far, right, it is really the first generation that is the most by far vocal. 1.5 generation, some are less attached to it and so on. So that is the best I can answer. Whereas to Nancy's question, I don't know. That is such a big question, that perhaps, the audience maybe have a better idea than I do. But you're right. I think you are right to recognize, that reality of international students, right, who grew up with the red flag, and so the yellow flag is alien to them, and how does it work out? And I think that, in the last few years, there might have been some debate about that at certain campuses. So, yeah, but other than that, I don't know.
No. Vivian, are you still there? If you want to ask the questions yourself.
Oh, she said that she can't. She's busy in a room and can't talk. So.
Oh, I see. Okay, so maybe I can ask.
I have another question for Vinh regarding nhạc vàng.
Okay, please go ahead. Now that you can speak.
Nhạc vàng, I think it won the heart and soul of overseas Vietnamese as well as the Vietnamese in Vietnam. The Vietnamese communist government do not like it. See, people love that, but it's just in the public, in personal life, they sing. Everyone sing nhạc vàng, in Vietnam. So my question, should we ask? We concentrate on why is that? Why people love nhạc vàng? So that explain better. I see a scholar can dig into that question. Why? Vietnamese love nhạc vàng that much. Yes.
So I don't want to look at any of these cultural objects as somehow having some type of more supernatural power than they normally would. So I would look at them in terms of cultural products of a time that does have an afterlife. And I think, like the flag, every time they get recontextualized, they pick up steam, and we really have to sort of pay attention to that. The perspective I'm trying to go against is not to say that it's better than any other types of music necessarily, like to single it out, but to sort of look at it within its historical context and say, look, for a long time, it's really been dismissed as something, and clearly it's not ineffective politically. And on a cultural level, we can't deny its significance either, because people obviously enjoy it to the point where, they have to do it. But I would say, materially speaking, nhạc vàng does come from a tradition of really, really educated musicians, and it is coming from a class that was able to produce that type of cultural product in Vietnam, where we didn't have something akin to that prior. Even if nhạc vàng or nhạc đỏ or whatever have you sort of are contentious politically, I would still say it's probably some of the higher form of music production we had at the time. And when it was imported, I guess, into the United States, or when the diaspora occurred, they just so happened to bring along that tradition as well, because some of Lam Phung, for example, was very prolific in writing. So you have to think of these weren't just random people who just produced songs and they just so happened to be popular. These were actually really well studied artists and musicians that collaborated. So in a way, I think our attachment to it is on the one hand political, but on the other hand, they're actually just it's actually just good music. I do literature, so I can only look at them lyrically, and I would say they're probably some of the better written songs that I've encountered. But again, sort of politics aside, I'm also comparing it to the type of very watered down music that we have currently, at least in Vietnam, or at least some of the Vietnamese American sort of productions in the US, mainly sort of taking from mainstream American music. So the contrast here isn't good enough to sort of say, oh, well, this is why it's so wonderful. But I just think that we really have to look at it as, well, it was significant politically, and on the other hand, it was well produced, but it was also coming from people who are very well trained in music. I think that's probably the bottom line.
That's a great answer to the very difficult question. But let's turn to Vivian's first question for E. So she's saying that she was struck by the Geneva narrative of communism, and wonder if there was something unique about the Geneva narrative. Could you?
Oh yeah, I tried to answer that earlier. I stated that it was unique in the sense that it spoke directly to the Vietnamese historical experience. But yeah, so yeah, okay, you got it. Cool. All right.
Okay, we can move on to Trinh for the next question about the matriarchal past to the restoration of Vietnamese soul, and how did this relate to the patriarchal norms of American conservatism?
You are
you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
My apologies. It wasn't going to be much of an answer. Anyway, I wanted to admit that I don't have a good answer to this question. It's something that I can look into and perhaps find a way to expand on. But I can say something about how at the center of Kim Din's thinking is the claim that Vietnamese were pastoralists, and that is a more evolved form than nomads, which is to say that there is some claim, those who work from Kim Din's philosophy, that Vietnam were the first, that the ancient Vietnamese were some of the first people to cultivate rice, and that they have an originary attachment to land and water, to the places they live. And this resonates with very core ideas of republicanism, which, yes, I will have to explore more.
Next is for Vinh, the parallel between rhizomatic nationalism among Vietnamese Americans and the people in Hong Kong today.
I'm not sure what the question is, but I do see the sort of parallel that you're referring to. And I think what's happening in Hong Kong, even though I guess my politics aren't necessarily I'm not really focused on Hong Kong. It's just like not one of my areas. But I guess given the current political climate, you sort of can't go through life without hearing about Hong Kong. And I think what's most prevalent about what we see from Hong Kong is the type of like political solidarity that you have from abroad, or the type of draw that it has. And on the one hand, I do think it has it's tied to a type of nationalism and a sort of like Chinese diaspora kind of way. But then on the other hand, I think it's also tied to a sort of very anti-Chinese imperialist rhetoric that is very easily caught on by other communities. And so for me, when I'm trying to think of nationalism, not just Vietnamese nationalism, but nationalism in our current day, it really is not a monolithic thing anymore. We do still think, I think we these days tend to think of them in terms of networks, and particularly the ways that things have been unfolding in the past 10 years at least, that a lot of this type of activism is happening online. And so there is no real center anymore. It's really connected in other forms. And so, of course, when we look at some things that are happening in Hong Kong, I feel like a lot of people, even in Vietnam, see that as a sort of like lighthouse, I guess, or some type of signal that change is potentially there. But I'm also not really hopeful with it, because as politically active as that type of nationalism can be, I'm like very cautiously optimistic about the type of results that it can yield politically for people, especially if you're hoping for something like, you know, an actual regime change or something like that. In terms of like Nhạc Vàng in Vietnam, I think it's great that it's re-entering the country, but it's re-entering the country, and I give this in Oregon, is it's re-entering the country in a way where people are really just depoliticizing it and consuming it as a cultural product of the past, to say I have taste as a way of discerning themselves from the sort of contemporary culture. And you see this with a very like Indo-Chic culture that's happening, not just in Vietnam, but also in Cambodia and in Laos.
Right. I don't see. Go ahead. Yeah.
I have just one observation and a question for everybody, panelists and audience alike. It's so interesting, listening to these presentation and also the questions. Like the 1980s seem to figure quite a bit in this presentation, right? Like Kim Din was like, that was when he was publishing these things, right? And then, his presentation talked about Kháng Chiến. I mean, it was a little short, brief, right? But it was clearly huge, massive, in my opinion, and so on. I'm just curious, for everybody here, who have studied, in whatever subject you have been doing, was there anything important about the 1980s in terms of the diaspora? I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at you, Ivan. I guess I'm wondering, like, was there something like, something groundbreaking about the 1980s in terms of transnational, monetary, or one, memorialization? I mean, I know that you wrote about the 1990s, but I'm just curious if there is anything, because in a way, for me, a historian, I like to go back, right? And even though my presentation was mostly about the 1990s and to today, I think, though, there was so much about the 1980s that need to be.
I can answer to that. I don't know. It's the, maybe need more study on it. But two subjects standing out for the 80s was refugee, both people. And then secondly is the, giải phóng, liberate Vietnam from the communists. That the two.
Kháng chiến.
Yeah, kháng chiến. Yeah, that's the two subjects stand out in our community during the 1980s.
If I can just add to that, what resonates in, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, very, very quickly. What resonates in my research on Kim Den is that in the 1970s, 1980s, there was a real existential threat that was felt by Vietnamese intellectuals in the diaspora. So as we know, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam's policies of sending South Vietnamese and men and women to the vast, hardly understood network of prison camps, their seasoned property destroying by edict the RBN's cultural remains, which they call poisonous cultural vestiges of neocolonialism. This was actually a real existential threat. And the Vietnamese who found their way out of the country share the fear that one day the Vietnamese would vanish among the masses of men, and that they would be a people without history. And that was really the impetus for reframing literature and the arts as the domain where Vietnamese culture and history would be kept alive.
One's interested.
Oh, go ahead, Ivan. Sorry.
Ivan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Twin, since you mentioned me, one of the things that I talked about yesterday was that the 1980s sees a lot of secondary migration where Vietnamese refugees who were dispersed around 50 states, and this was an intentional strategy by the U.S. government, were starting to get on their feet and move from places like Iowa, say, and go to places like California where there were Asian American community nodes. And I think, with that process in the 1980s, you start to see the evolution of cultural communities that are able to focus more on cultural expression. And there was a mention of Adelaide of Rays, I think, by Vin, and she talks about kind of musical production in California, kind of starting to re-evolve in the 1980s because you had these rich, vibrant community nodes that are starting to develop. So I think the 80s are significant in where you start to see a more Vietnamese American cultural expression.
So then for me, I would say that the outbreak of the Third Indochina War would be one of the most significant because it greatly politicized the situation in Indochina. And the second one is that Vietnamese refugees enter not only the American political conversation, but the international conversation. So then Carter made human rights a primary issue. And then the subsequent waves of both people created what it was called, the crisis, the migration crisis. So then that sort of created the political environment in which a sort of like, it was necessary for there to be a refugee identity or articulation of a refugee narrative in order for people to mobilize and whatnot. So then I think those were some core world historical stuff that was going on.
Can I also add to that? I think the late 1980s is also very important. 1989 with the passage of the Comprehensive Action Plan, which instituted refugee status screening in the refugee camps across Southeast Asia and in Hong Kong. And I think that was a moment when, really there's in the diaspora, there's a movement to really assert the refugee status of all the people who had left Vietnam, who were still leaving Vietnam by boat at the time. And then I think in the 90s, one of the catalysts was the high-tech incident in Little Saigon. And I think one of the images that you showed was probably taken by Lee King Chup at one of the protests. But also the normalization, with Vietnam was a major moment in which I think the Vietnamese diaspora really felt threatened by the incursion, of a potential normalization in relationship. So, thinking about your question, those would be some of the things that I would think about.
And one more date too, I think, is just the Vietnam's government's economic reform, creating that shift and that kind of crisis in the diaspora to see what are we fighting against if they're changing their economic stance, no longer really a framework of communism or socialist society.
when was Asia established?
As soon as, I think right after people got over there, I think they were starting to do small productions. I don't have the exact year.
1980s, I think.
Yeah,
yeah,
but
maybe because I remember, like, you know, like the Thuy Nga one, right? It was initially produced in France, and so I think the U.S. was, you know, I mean, the Vietnamese in the U.S. was kind of behind, right? I mean, for whatever.
Right.
Yeah, so I have like two comments on that. I'm currently reading the Linda Lay Heroine book, and she has this character called the Vedette de Saigon. And it's really interesting the way that she's sort of narrating like this old, you know, Saigonese socialite woman who is just like very well dressed, very pretty. And apparently, allegedly in this novel, she has an affair with Nguyen Cao Kỳ. And so it's sort of like, she doesn't name him, but obviously we understand that that's a thing. And I think that there's something to be said about the way that a lot of like the musicians at the time, because of the way that like Saigon society was, it really pushed a lot of these people into upper echelon of society, and they were really in close contact with a lot of the politics. Not to mention a lot of the singers started out singing for GIs. So I think it wasn't just the push of like the sort of diasporic community, but it's also in a way really like helped by some Americans, I think, at least in the 90s, that were they themselves getting nostalgic for their experiences in Vietnam, because I can remember sort of like old veterans talking about listening to, what was that rock band in Vietnam, BBC? It was a Vietnamese rock band, and they were getting really nostalgic because they missed that type of thing. So in a way, there's a like resurgence in the 80s because I think definitively, you know, the war is done at that point, I think, for everybody. But the other thing I want to comment on is, in addition to her, I mean, I'm also reading some other, I guess, writers who really started not just writing in the 80s, but writing about the 80s, mostly because they were coming, that's the time in which they came. And so their understanding of themselves as a sort of like, not truly an immigrant that you would contrast with the later 90s and early 2000s, but truly what constitutes the sort of Vietnamese diasporic experience. So I think a lot of cultural production is like really emphasized on that, because some of these people were really the first to learn the language, at least in Canada, for example. Kim Thuy, like all of her books have to do with the boat people. And most Canadians, like Quebecois that I've met, that has spoken to me is like, oh, you're Vietnamese. And in a way, for them, it's always like, I know Kim Thuy, like not know her personally, but I've read that, you know? And so I don't think just the products themselves, but the type of aura that they have is that the 80s becomes the moment in which Vietnam isn't just Vietnam, Vietnam becomes global. So I think there's that type of element to it as well.
Another thing about the 90s is the settlement of the political prisoner to the US. So the landscape of and the mood of the anti-communist protests or whatever, it changed, because the late 80s, we don't see, you see the meltdown of the protests, and they're not protest as much anymore, because in the early 80s, they protest you know, to fight for both people, for refugee, fundraising to help, you know, the refugee camp in Southeast Asia. But in the 90s, starting like 1991 and 92, the political prisoners starting resettlement into the US, and that brings the whole spectrum of anti-communist atmosphere, because they came from the camp, they were tortured, they were blah, blah, blah. So in the 90s, you can see a lot of protests, and, you know, it endured until nowadays, I would say. Yes.
Wow, such a great discussion, very stimulating. All sorts of ideas flying. Thank you so much, everyone. Any final questions or comments before you know, we end this? Anyone? All right, great. Yeah, it's so great to meet all of you, and please join me to thank the presenters and the audience for having stayed with us for so long.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. What time is it in Singapore now? It got to be late or early, I guess.
Thank you,
By
Ivan.
this time, it's 9 o'clock or so. Yeah, good to see you all. I won't be able to join tomorrow's panel, but that's in the middle of the night. But it's really nice to see you all. And it's such a fascinating set of presentations. I'm looking forward to learning more about your work as we go forward.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
the host. Wonderful, Tương, did a good job. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Oh, thank you so much for